Haman has just been hanged on the very gallows that he had built to hang Mordecai the Jew, and Esther has yet one more step of courage to take to save her life and the lives of her people. So let's jump into Esther chapter 8. Hey, what's up, ladies? Welcome to Her Journey with God. I'm Sarah, and on this channel, you're going to find content that is faith-based and especially geared towards understanding biblical womanhood and what femininity looks like for us as Christian women today. And if you've been following along in the series on Esther, you have likely seen in the last chapter that Haman was hanged on the gallows that he had built to hang Mordecai the Jew, which is a complete turnaround. As we've been going through the book of Esther, we've been seeing how God's sovereignty is at work behind the scenes, bringing his sovereign plans to pass in our lives, whether we understand it or not, whether we recognize it and see what he's doing, or whether he is simply behind the scenes at work in the details of our lives. And so I am really excited to jump into Esther chapter 8 and study how one more courageous step of bold faith turned everything around for Esther and her people. So grab your Bible and your favorite drink and let's jump into Esther chapter 8. Verse 1. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Now we see that Esther is revealing to the king who Mordecai is to her, that he is her cousin who raised her, that he's also a Jew who's destined to be destroyed because of this royal decree that Haman created that was sealed with the king's signet ring and cannot be reversed. And we see that the king has put Esther in charge of Haman's property. Esther in turn puts Mordecai in charge of that. And the same ring that was given to Haman has now been transferred over to Mordecai, which is a very interesting reversal here of how the power had been in the man's hand who was against the Jews is now being given to a Jew himself. Verse 3, Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king, and she said, If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows, because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews, in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring, for an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. Wow, so here we see Esther falling at the king's feet, and this is a complete difference from what we saw previously in the chapter where Esther very carefully stood quietly in the king's court until he noticed her and held out the scepter to her and invited her in to make a request from him. And here we see shameless Esther throwing herself at the king's feet, crying for the first time in this book and pleading with the king, please don't let my people, me and my household, be destroyed. The king, for a second time, holds out this golden scepter to Esther as a sign of favor and acceptance to her. And she touches the golden scepter again and, gets a hold of herself and makes her request. And the king is reminding her that royal decree that has already been put into action and signed and sealed with his ring the royal order that Haman created, it cannot be revoked. It can't be thrown out. But he has given his own signet ring, the ring that had been given to Haman. He's now given it to Esther and to Mordecai, saying, basically, write a new order, write whatever you want to regarding the Jews. Verse 9, the king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews, to the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces, from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent the letters by mounted couriers, riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. On one day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Here we see a new royal order being created by the scribes. The original order was that the Jews there was going to come a day when the Jews could be destroyed by anybody who wants to murder them in the streets. But now this new order is saying that the Jews have the right to defend themselves and kill anyone who tries to kill them. And this day on which they can do that is the same day of the decree that Haman created, which is on the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar. And so we see that the Jews are now allowed to defend themselves and to plunder the goods, basically to take the property and belongings of the people that are trying to kill them, that they are now allowed to kill to defend themselves. They can also plunder the goods of those people who are trying to attack them. What an amazing reversal from the situation where the Jews were about to be destroyed, but now they're given the power to defend themselves. And this decree, this new royal order, is going out to the whole kingdom, all 127 provinces, this massive kingdom that King Ahasuerus has rule over. And this order is being sent out to all the places where the first decree was made. Verse 13, a copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown, and a robe of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Here we see Mordecai putting on these beautiful, colorful robes, and this is such a stark contrast to only a few chapters back when he was sitting in sackcloth and ashes, grieving over the decree that the Jews were about to be destroyed. And now this was a complete turnaround. Here he is dressed in royal finery, strolling about with gladness and joy, and the whole presence, the whole atmosphere for the Jews has changed. It's no longer about a fear of oppression and certain death, but now it is joy and brightness at the hope of the future that God has prepared in advance for them, that they would be delivered, that they would have a chance to defend themselves. And as I'm reading this, it's reminding me of Isaiah chapter 61, where it says, starting in verse 3, to grant those who mourn in Zion, to give them a beautiful headdress instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of a faint spirit, that they may be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. Instead of your shame, there shall be a double portion. Instead of dishonor, they shall rejoice in their lot. Therefore, in their land they shall possess a double portion. They shall have everlasting joy. What a beautiful passage that talks about God's goodness and how He often trades our ashes, those burnt, torn, broken places of our lives, and gives us beauty in place of that. He brings beauty out of the ashes. I can remember back to several years ago when I was hiking in Colorado, where I was living at the time, and this trail specifically had been through a wildfire. You could see blackened trees everywhere. There were still ashes on the ground in places. But in those ashes, you could see growing up out of it the most beautiful wildflowers. And someone approached me on the trail and he told me that because the forest here had been burned, the soil had become very nutrient rich and perfectly suited for these beautiful flowers to grow up in it. And I am just thinking of this story of how God brings beauty out of the ashes. Yes, there may be a season of life that is super difficult and just feels like a wildfire has gone through and it's massive devastation. And yet out of that, somehow God turns it for good. Romans 8:28 promises that God turns everything for the good of those who love Him. He's at work behind the scenes, working good in the details of our lives, even the hard things, even those difficult places. The Jews here were almost without hope when that royal decree had been created, that they were about to be destroyed. And sometimes the situations in our life can feel like that as well. Maybe it's a doctor's report, or maybe it's a relationship that has been destroyed. Whatever that broken, hard season is, God has promised to turn it for good. He may not want us to go through that hardship. He may not create that hardship for us. He has allowed it for some reason, but if He allows it, He promises to work it out for good, to give us beauty for ashes. And I love Psalm chapter 23, starting in verse 5. It says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." And we see that table being prepared for the Jews in the presence of their enemies. This was God's favor, His divine sovereign will for the Jews here, that He would prepare a place for them in the presence of the enemies. This royal decree that they were being allowed to write for themselves was creating a safe place for them in the midst of the destruction that the enemy was preparing for them, that meant harm against them. God was turning it for good, because now the Jews had a place in this land. They were no longer people with a hidden identity, having to live out their faith in secret. They were given a place of authority. They could defend themselves. Their identity was no longer hidden. And how good is God that He prepares a place for us, even in the presence of our enemies. Friends, I hope this is encouraging, that God brings beauty in place of ashes, that He turns mourning into dancing and gives us a beautiful headdress in place of ashes and sackcloth. And we can trust God with our own difficult stories today. Friends, I hope this was helpful. If it was, please click the like and subscribe buttons. And I can't wait to see you right back here for Esther chapters 9 and 10 to finish out the book. And after that, we're going to take a little bit deeper dive into some lessons from the book of Esther, things that we can apply as women today. So I'll see you right back here. God bless you.